I want to bring in NBC's Vaughn Hilliard covering the White House. Ashley Parker is staff writer at The Atlantic, where she co-wrote the story on Trump's phone. And Tim Miller is writer-at-large for The Bulwark and host of the Bulwark podcast. Both Ashley and Tim are MSNBC political analysts. So, Vaughn, let's start with the fact that we are at the start of what is expected to be a very dangerous hurricane season. We know storms kill hundreds of people every year, hundreds of millions of dollars in damage is done. The question is then, is FEMA up to the task? What are you hearing?
Because of the DOGE cuts and because of voluntary decisions of some federal FEMA employees to leave in these first 5 months of this administration, FEMA is looking at its workforce being down by about 1/3, 2,000 employees having left the disaster response agency. And just last week, FEMA announcing that 16 of their senior executives had left. And of course, the Reuters report about this, what DHS is calling supposed joke, that the new administrator was not aware of when hurricane season was. We should note that this new FEMA administrator came on board after the previous Trump-selected nominee went before a confirmation hearing and suggested that he believed that FEMA should, in fact, still be a disaster agency and should not be banished, as the president had suggested. Just 24 hours after he made those public comments, he was removed from his capacity. And so there are a lot of serious questions ahead. Of course, it's worth noting that it was just last year during the 2024 campaign that the Trump campaign, the then candidate, was blasting the federal government's response under the Biden administration to Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. And so there are a lot of questions for this administration as these senior executives at FEMA, as well as a broad share of this workforce, have departed in these first months of 2025.
So, Ashley, you have FEMA losing about a quarter of its full-time staff. There are departments, there are parts of FEMA that are getting cut. From your conversation, does the administration genuinely believe that these cuts are impacting only waste and fraud and won't have serious operational implications?
That is what they are messaging and what they're claiming. But when you talk to people in these agencies and in these departments, and these are the people who, many of them, the career bureaucrats, are the experts, there is an incredible sense that you cannot do cuts that are so deep and so far, at least in such a haphazard manner and chaotic manner as we have seen from DOGE, and not lose good people, not have unintended consequences, not just now that we're aware of, but for instance, just to take FEMA for an example, later in hurricane season, which, yes, does exist, right? There is real widespread concern throughout the government, but if you talk to the president and you talk to top people, they say that they are, just rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. But the last thing I will say is I've talked to some people in the government in Trump's inner circle who, when one of their cuts or one of their maneuvers ends up, say, hurting constituents in a red state, and they go to their, their House member or their Republican senator, then these people around the president do hear about these real world consequences from lawmakers who say, you know what, this cut was not good for instance, our farmers.
So, Tim, let me go back to David Richardson, who took over as the acting FEMA administrator just a month ago. He has no disaster response experience. He had a meeting with folks at the Wall Street Journal, and they say he seemed surprised at the vast scope of FEMA's responsibilities. And Reuters is reporting, quote, before joining FEMA, Richardson was assistant secretary at DHS's Office for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction, which he has told staff he will continue to lead. So he's going to be head of fighting weapons of mass destruction in addition to leading FEMA. Is heading up FEMA, Tim, not a full-time job?
I think it's more than a full-time job. And, I think that we're really concerned about those DEI hires, Chris. Like this administration, they promise they're fully committed to meritocracy. They only want to bring the best in. That's why they've brought somebody in who has absolutely no experience to lead FEMA, who doesn't know there's a hurricane season, and they have a weekend talk show host leading the military. So, there may be some mixed messages there. I think that the actual, on-the-ground impacts here are important to talk about. Vaughn mentioned that Trump campaigned extensively, really. It wasn't just kind of one-off thing in 2024 about the response to Hurricane Helene in North Carolina and how incompetent the Biden administration was supposedly when it comes to that. And now they're gutting the types of officials that would be responding to not just those types of hurricanes in the future, but that hurricane, right? Like they have cuts to response to Hurricane Helene. People are not getting, what they had been promised from the government under this administration. We reported at the Bulwark a couple months ago about a guy that was a chief of staff at one of the regional FEMA offices that was wrongly fired in the DOGE cuts when they sent one of those mass emails out and said, you're fired. And after that story, a couple hours later, you got a call from HR that was like, oh, well, you can be rehired again. Like, this is not the way to run an emergency management office. Surely there are some parts of the federal government that don't have that kind of urgent responsiveness that is needed, where we could weather, so to speak, these types of issues. Like, FEMA's not one of those, and we are coming into hurricane season now, and I think that the impact is going to be tangible for people.
And let me talk to you as well about the cuts to the Department of Education. The programs that look like they're going to take the brunt of this are rural schools, literacy instruction, students who are experiencing homelessness. They could lose 70% of their funding, according to NPR. What's the political benefit in that?
Yeah. Well, another merit hire there at the Department of Education, we should mention, a former wrestling executive. The Republicans, this is one thing that is not really unique to Trump. For a long time, Republicans have been talking about getting rid of the Department of Education. There is a lot of stuff in the Department of Education that, I think could probably be directed to other places. But not some of those programs you lay out. And as you mentioned, I think that there's this delay, in this MAGA Republican Party, where there's some of these old, kind of habits from the old Republican Party that they're still acting on, old talking points, when now, a lot of the MAGA voters are people that use these government services. We're seeing that in Medicaid with that discussion happening on the Hill, but you also see it here at the Department of Education. Linda McMahon was questioned about that today by Chris Murphy, and the result is that they just don't have good answers. And I think they're hoping that the people that are suffering the consequences from this are either loyal MAGA folks, or that it won't actually matter to them politically, because of the nature of kind of how polarized the country is.
And Ashley, I want to talk to you about your reporting on Trump's phone. You called it the most pivotal technological device in the federal government, because anybody who has his number can, and it seems does, just call him up out of the blue. Were you surprised? Tell us about your findings and what the concerns are about that phone.
Well, there's the obvious concerns of hacking, cybersecurity, which then candidate Trump was informed of during the campaign. And what was interesting was, and it was not just the Trump campaign and his running mate, it was also people on the Democratic side. But on the Trump campaign, some people, moved to burner phones. They began more meticulously using Signal and other apps that are harder to listen in on. But Trump was not particularly bothered, because since he first became president, he has pretty much been ignoring the repeated entreaties of his staff and of national security officials to abandon his personal cell phone. And, the people we talked to said, in another world, he's sort of Don from Queens. He's a talk radio guy. He likes to talk on the phone. He can be very persuasive on the phone. He likes being able to not just stay in touch with friends and family and advisors and Mar-a-Lago members, but, I talked to one person who said, sometimes I'm on the phone with the president and he'll see a foreign number incoming, which you can tell from the country code. He won't know necessarily which country or who is on the other line, but he'll hop off immediately and say, someone from another country is calling me. I've got to go. I might want to talk to them. So he thrives on that excitement. We likened it to putting a coin in a gumball machine and seeing, which flavor rolls out of who's calling, who might it be? And then the other risk, of course, is that he has a call with, say, a fellow foreign leader. Forget about the espionage, but if he doesn't unilaterally, he may not do the necessary prep on the front end, or there's the risk that his government is in the dark about an agreement he reaches or a bit of information that's exchanged that in a traditional world and to mitigate risk, national security staffers, State Department staffers, top advisors really ought to be aware of.
We're out of time, but I want to ask you this just to make sure I'm clear. So if he sees a foreign number and it says, for example, +86, which is China, or it says +7, which is Russia, but it doesn't say who it is, he picks it up anyway? I'm guessing all of us on our panel don't even pick up a phone that we don't know who's on the other end.
Very occasionally when I worry it's one of someone from my kid's school, I pick up. But
Okay.
no, I generally don't. And my reporting is it's not that he does this every single time, but someone has been on the phone with him a number of times when a call has come in from an unknown number, sometimes from a foreign number. And yes, he will just say, foreign number calling, gotta go, because he wants to pick it up.